So there's this empire. At its peak, it controls basically the entire Mediterranean world, from Britain to Egypt to the Persian border. Roughly 70 million people living under one government, one currency, and an absurdly good road network. Rome isn't just a city anymore, it's a brand. And then, over the course of a few centuries, it just stops existing. Not overnight. Nothing this big falls overnight. It's more like watching a very slow, very expensive building slowly get its bricks stolen one at a time, until one day someone notices there's no building left. This is the story of how the most powerful empire in the ancient world quietly bled out. Let's set the stage. By the year 180, Rome has just wrapped up what historians later call the Pax Romana. 2 centuries of relative peace and stability under a string of surprisingly competent emperors. Rome feels permanent. Eternal, even. That's literally the nickname, the Eternal City. Nobody in the year 180 thinks this thing is going anywhere. Then the guy in charge dies, and his son Commodus takes over, and Commodus is, to put it generously, not built for the job. He'd rather fight in gladiator matches he's rigged to win than actually govern. He's eventually assassinated, and Rome enters a stretch of civil wars over who gets to be emperor next. This becomes a running theme. Rome does not have a clean succession system. Whoever has the army's loyalty gets the throne, which means the throne becomes something you fight for rather than inherit peacefully. And that instability never fully goes away again. By the middle of the 3rd century, things get genuinely ugly. Historians call this stretch from around 235 to 284 the crisis of the 3rd century, and it earns the name. In about 50 years, Rome goes through more than 20 different emperors, most of whom die violently, usually murdered by their own soldiers. The empire nearly splits into 3 competing chunks. Plague sweeps through the population. The currency gets debased so aggressively, emperors literally mixing cheaper metal into coins to stretch the budget, that the economy starts to seize up. Meanwhile, outside groups along the borders, various Germanic peoples, and a resurgent Persian empire to the east start testing the fences and finding them a lot weaker than expected. Rome barely survives this. It gets pulled back together by a series of tough military emperors. And then in 284, a guy named Diocletian takes the throne and decides the real problem is that one person cannot possibly run something this large anymore. His solution? Split the job. He creates the Tetrarchy, a system with 2 senior emperors and 2 junior ones, dividing administrative duties across the empire's territory. It's a reasonable fix for an unreasonable amount of empire, and for a while, it actually works. It also plants the seed for something bigger. The empire is now functionally operating as an eastern half and a western half, even before anyone calls it that officially. Enter Constantine. After more civil wars, because there are always more civil wars, Constantine ends up as sole emperor by 324. 2 things he does change the entire trajectory of the empire. First, he legalizes and personally favors Christianity, a once persecuted minority religion that will, within a century, become the empire's dominant faith. Second, he builds a brand new capital city on the site of an old Greek town called Byzantium, renames it after himself, Constantinople, and essentially creates a second Rome in the east, better positioned for trade and defense. This matters more than it sounds like. The wealthier, more defensible eastern half, centered on Constantinople, is going to survive for another 1,000 years after the western half collapses. Rome, the actual city, becomes increasingly less important to actually running the empire, even while it stays symbolically important as the capital everyone still associates with the name. Now here's where the pressure really starts building. Far to the east, a nomadic group called the Huns starts expanding aggressively across Central Asia in the late 300s, and this sets off a chain reaction, sometimes called the barbarian migrations, where various Germanic peoples get pushed westward, fleeing the Huns and looking for new land. One of these groups, the Goths, ends up at the Roman border in 376, asking for permission to cross into imperial territory as refugees. Rome says yes, but handles the resettlement badly. Corrupt local officials exploit the starving refugees, overcharging them for food, and the situation boils over into open revolt. In 378, Roman and Gothic forces clash at the Battle of Adrianople, and it goes catastrophically for Rome. The Eastern Emperor, Valens, dies on the battlefield, along with a huge chunk of Rome's professional army. It's one of the worst military defeats in Roman history, and it proves something uncomfortable. Rome's legions, once unstoppable, can now lose badly to the same groups they used to easily push around. From here, the western half of the empire in particular starts struggling to hold itself together. It's dealing with constant pressure on its borders, a shrinking tax base because it's lost so much productive farmland to conflict and instability, and a series of weak or child emperors who are really just puppets for whichever general or advisor actually holds the power behind the throne. In 410, the unthinkable happens. Alaric, a Gothic leader who spent years alternating between fighting Rome and negotiating with Rome, and getting repeatedly stiffed on payments and promises he was owed, finally loses patience and marches his forces into the city of Rome itself. He sacks it. Not the empire's capital anymore, administratively, but still the symbolic heart of everything Rome represents. It's the first time in 800 years that Rome, the actual city, has fallen to a foreign force, and the psychological shock ripples across the entire ancient world. People genuinely start asking whether this is the beginning of the end. It kind of is. Over the next few decades, the Western Empire keeps losing territory it can't get back. North Africa, one of its most valuable breadbaskets, falls to the Vandals in 439. Britain gets effectively abandoned decades earlier when Rome pulls its legions out to deal with problems closer to home. Gaul and Spain fragment as various Germanic kingdoms carve out permanent territory that used to be Roman provinces. In 451, Rome actually wins one, sort of helping to turn back Attila the Hun and his forces at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, one of the last times the Western Empire manages to field a genuinely effective coalition army. But it's a last gasp, not a recovery. 4 years later, in 455, Rome gets sacked again, this time by the Vandals, and the word Vandal ends up permanently attached to the English language because of how thoroughly they trashed the place. By this point, the Western Roman army is barely Roman in any meaningful sense anymore. It's largely made up of Germanic soldiers and led increasingly by Germanic generals because Rome simply doesn't have enough of its own manpower or money left to field a traditional legion system. These generals are the ones actually running the show, propping up a series of increasingly powerless teenage emperors as figureheads. Which brings us to 476. A Germanic military leader named Odoacer, who's been serving in the Roman army, looks at the current puppet emperor, a teenager with the almost comically fitting name Romulus Augustulus, and decides there's no point pretending anymore. He deposes him, and instead of installing yet another puppet, he just doesn't bother replacing him. He sends the imperial regalia off to Constantinople and rules Italy himself as a king rather than in the name of an emperor. No huge final battle, no dramatic last stand. The Western Roman Empire just quietly stops having an emperor, and mostly, nobody at the time treats it as some enormous historic turning point. It's more of a formality catching up to a reality that had been true for a while already. The Roman Empire, as a functioning state controlling Italy and the West, had really been dying for decades. 476 is just the year it stops breathing. Here's the twist most people forget. The Roman Empire doesn't actually end in 476. Only the western half does. The eastern half, ruled from Constantinople, keeps going and going and going. We usually call it the Byzantine Empire in hindsight, but the people living in it never stopped calling themselves Romans. That eastern continuation survives for almost another 1,000 years, all the way until 1453, when Constantinople finally falls to the Ottoman Turks. So when people say the fall of Rome, they really mean the fall of the western half, worn down over roughly 3 centuries by civil wars, economic decay, an overstretched border, and waves of migration and invasion it could no longer absorb or repel. It's not one villain, one battle, or one bad decision. It's death by 1,000 cuts, administered over generations until the world's most dominant empire quietly became a memory. The legacy sticks around, though. Roman law, language, architecture, and infrastructure shape the medieval and modern world that grows up in its ruins. Half of Europe's languages descend from Latin. Empires for the next 1,500 years keep trying to claim they're the real successor to Rome, right up through the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. Because even after it collapsed, everyone still wanted a piece of what it used to be. Thanks for watching Historian Wojak. See you in the next one.